Hello, I'm Matthias Martins. Welcome back to my reading of my book, How to Do Things with Stories. We're on to Chapter 6. Chapter 6, I believe, is the longest chapter of the book, so settle in. Chapter 6. Story Structure. Storytelling is most enjoyable when the story comes naturally. But a story that feels easy and natural in the telling is rarely as easy and natural to create. Among the storytelling crafts, writing especially is full of lonely work. Between the flashes of insight that make it worthwhile, there are stretches of uncertainty and creative barrenness. When insight strikes us like lightning from the blue, we can feel as though we've been favored by a magical muse. We feel like our success depends on a spirit who descends on us only rarely, and always in her own time. But a writer who feels this way soon learns by error the price of a fatal mistake. The mistake of waiting idly for a visit from her muse. If all she does is wait, she finds that the muse does not come and see her. This is because those barren times in the creative process, the stretches spent laboring over the page with little joy and much effort under the surface, actually are teeming with life. Without them, the way is not cleared for those flashes of insight. Hence, a writer must be able to work. And if the muse should never come, if lightning should never strike in the course of her authorship, then her ability to work is all she will have. She must take up the mind-numbing, toilsome task of creating her own miracle. That has been the purpose of this book so far. We seek to show how a writer can be creative in a conscious, deliberate, even effortful way, instead of only following impulses. We need this because our creative impulses will fail us, and if we do not consciously know what we are doing, we will not even be able to identify what it is that we have failed to do. The method I describe in this book has been, when you know what comes next, write it. When you don't, study the dramatic questions and the intended effect or message. One of these will point the way to what must happen next in the story. But what happens when this method leads us into a dead end? What happens when one chapter flows beautifully into the next, and that flows beautifully into the next and the next, until at the end we have a closing chapter so alien to the opening that one can hardly believe they belong to the same book? What then? It is time to talk about structuring your story. Structuring, like writing, is a task that sometimes feels effortless and natural. The same instinct that allows us to imagine chains of events also guides us to position them into a larger pattern. There is a very common type of pattern that emerges from this process. It looks something like this. First, we meet the hero in her familiar world, and then we introduce something exceptional to that world. This might be a catastrophe, a deadly or mysterious stranger, or perhaps simply the enticement of adventure. Whatever it is, it makes normal life impossible. It demands to be noticed. Our protagonist encounters the exceptional and clashes with it in ways that alter and challenge her. Through these encounters, the nature of the exceptional is revealed. It shows signs that it might be grasped. In the final encounter, the protagonist gains mastery over the exceptional. Now she returns to her familiar world, where she finds that her relationship to it can never be the same. Why should this pattern be so common? Perhaps, indeed, because it is such a general description that it can be mapped onto almost anything. We can compare it to the well-known concept of the monomyth, an alleged universal story pattern that exists in all cultures, emerging from the unconscious mind, that reveals to the student the deepest truths of human nature. Sometimes analyzing stories with this concept can lead to overfitting, where we make unjustified leaps in order to line up a story with the components of the monomyth. What I have in mind is not so ambitious. The pattern I have described, the encounter with the familiar, where the protagonist masters the unfamiliar and is simultaneously and unknowingly transformed by it, is indeed common. But the reason I give for this is not that the story pattern rests in our unconscious minds and shapes our creative impulses. Rather, it is because this story structure mirrors the process of learning. In learning, we begin with the familiar, e.g., 6 times 7. Encounter the unfamiliar, what times what equals 35. And integrate the unfamiliar into the familiar. We learn about factoring. That is, in this example, we learn that 5 and 7 are the factors of 35. Each step in the learning process is, in essence, a little story. If we discover this structure of story naturally, it is because we naturally desire to teach. And this structure naturally supports teaching. But does this mean we should call it the fundamental story structure? If we did that, we'd be ignoring the wealth of stories, ancient and contemporary, that cannot be mapped onto this pattern. For one thing, we'd be ignoring the many stories that fail to end triumphantly. Perhaps these stories are still teaching stories, but with a different kind of lesson. They teach us that the unfamiliar is not always mastered. If your aim in telling stories is to teach, you might find a useful answer to the question of structure in the exceptional encounter story. Let your high points correspond to steps toward understanding. Let your low points correspond to confusions, and your climax correspond with mastery of the lesson, followed by a denouement of reflection. If we discover this structure of story naturally, it is because we naturally desire to teach, and this structure naturally supports teaching. But does this mean we should call it the fundamental story structure? If we did that, we'd be ignoring the wealth of stories, ancient and contemporary, that cannot be mapped onto this pattern. For one thing, we'd be ignoring the many stories that fail to end triumphantly. Perhaps these stories are still teaching stories, but with a different kind of lesson. They teach us that the unfamiliar is not always mastered. If your aim in telling stories is to teach, you might find a useful answer to the question of structure in the exceptional encounter story. Let your high points correspond to steps toward understanding, let your low points correspond to confusions, and your climax correspond with mastery of the lesson, followed by a denouement of reflection, and perhaps looking ahead to what can be learned next. But in the world of possible stories, this is perhaps a narrow goal to have and may not line up naturally with what you intend to do. We should look at story structure in a broader way that incorporates what we've already learned about how stories achieve their effects. We've already discussed how to use tension to point to questions that influence the reader. To extend this to the overall structure of a story, we can look at the tension wave as it changes in narrative time, and consider how different shapes of that wave will alter the delivery of the story's meaning. In a famous lecture, Kurt Vonnegut demonstrated a related way of analyzing stories, by graphing the emotional valence of various stories over the course of their telling. That's not so different from what we are doing here. Where Vonnegut framed it in terms of the ups and downs of the characters' fortunes, we frame it in terms of the intensity of their longings, how much they are pulled by desire toward their current goal. More accurately, we frame it in terms of the emotions of the ideal reader as he reacts to these longings of the characters. It is the reader's sympathy, not the emotions of the characters themselves, that drives and changes the reader in his process of reading the story. Before considering what shape of tension wave might be best suited to a certain goal, Let's take some time to explore our options. We'll consider the space of possible waves to get a sense of the types of story that might be out there. Can a story begin at a peak, at high tension? This is most often attempted with what is called a cold open, or in medias res. Usually, the cold open is a flash forward to a key moment later in the story. While a cold open may be high drama, is it really high tension? My answer is that, while the writer may think she's pulled the reader in with a dramatic open, the reader does not normally care about the peril of characters that do not yet have any reality for him. An intense opening moment might feel climactic for the writer, who knows the characters and the stakes already, but in the end it may leave the reader out in the cold. That doesn't mean that a cold open is always a mistake. The mistake is to expect a cold open to be effective in itself. What makes a cold open effective is the slow build of tension that follows, which the reader will interpret with foresight to the scene of the cold open. What about tension that, rather than beginning immediately, builds rapidly from nothing to an early peak? The trade-off we make with this structure is that plunging the reader straight into a state of sympathetic longing means that they may not remain engaged. Later narrative peaks will be overshadowed by the first, creating numbness. Some of the stories that best illustrate this structure and its unique effect are certain works of Franz Kafka, particularly The Metamorphosis and The Trial. In these stories, the protagonist initially is deeply afflicted by the problem they face, transformed into a cockroach, summoned to stand trial for an unknown charge. Yet, slowly, inexorably, they resign themselves to their fate, with the reader likely becoming similarly resigned. This is a challenging structure to do right. What about the reverse? Tension that slowly builds throughout until it is released at the end. This is closer to a more traditional story structure. If the tension simply builds steadily with no major peaks or dips, this resembles what's called the suspense genre, where a threat emerges slowly, building in menace, fully emerging only at the climax. Can a story end without the resolution of tension? This is what's known as a cliffhanger. Like a cold open, it is simple to do and seems as if it should be very effective. Therefore, like the cold open, its overuse has tarnished its reputation. There is nothing inherently wrong with a cliffhanger. It can be effective at driving the story's tension into the reader's mind. Consciously or unconsciously, readers will try to answer for themselves the dramatic question that the narrative left unanswered. It can also simply signal that the story isn't truly over and will be resolved in another installment. What about a story with no tension? This is more simply understood as a story that has no effect. If a story triggers no desire on the part of the reader, it has no power to influence him, even to compel him to continue reading. To round out the black sheep, what about a story with continuous high tension? I contend that such a thing has never succeeded and would be unwise to attempt. All the most enjoyable forms of excitement have breathers built in, and so it should be with writing. With those examples in mind, let's turn to consider the peaks and troughs that are far more typical of stories. A tension peak occurs when the dramatic question is most urgent. Will our hero die, despite wanting very badly to live? Will she win the desires of her heart? Will the window of her opportunity close before she can pass through? The ensuing trough occurs when tension relaxes. The question may be answered, or it may be simply deferred, submerged in confusion or remoteness from the events now being related to us. Recall that when we talk about the tension wave, we're talking about the sympathetic tension felt by the reader, not necessarily by a specific character. As a consequence, the tension wave does not have to track the fate of anyone in particular, or even follow the plot chronologically. It simply flows through the events related by the storyteller in the order in which those events are told. Those who have read virtually any advice on writing will be familiar with the standard 3-act story structure: rising action, climax, denouement. Different books may recommend a different number of minor peaks in advance of the ultimate climax, the most common choices being 1 and 2. But they have in common that they recommend a series of building conflicts and then a final, decisive conflict that resolves the dramatic question. This template is widely recommended for good reason. Firstly, gathering the tension into a series of well-defined peaks has the advantage that the reader will have an easy time forming a coherent, accurate memory of the story. He'll be able to take hold of it by its key moments, by its peaks, and work his way outward from there to recollect the rest. The peaks of the story are by definition the most intense emotionally, so they will also help him remember how the story made him feel. Conversely, the troughs in between give the reader time to digest what he has just experienced and commit it to memory before he must face whatever comes next. For this same reason, it is wise not to have too many peaks, or at least not to group them together too tightly. When every moment is vital, no moments are. The vital moments, or vital-seeming moments, will blur together in the reader's mind, and as a result, the memory of the story will be less durable and the story itself less effective. The standard template has the peaks rising higher and higher before the final, highest peak. Why do we seem to prefer this? Why not the reverse? There are a few reasons. 1. As we discussed earlier, a story cannot begin tense. To extend that idea a bit, the reader's maximum possible tension at a point in the story is limited by how invested they are, and that investment is limited by how much time they have spent understanding and feeling with the characters. Striving for a continuous rising action simply reflects this reality. 2. If the highest peak happens early in the story, the reader may feel cheated by the lack of action later on. He may feel that the latter half of the story wasn't worth the effort, since the most impactful resolution of the story happened prior to the majority of the plot. 3. If the highest peak happens early, it may have faded from memory when the reader at last finishes the book. Without that memory of high tension, the reader will feel less compelled to reflect on what he has experienced, and the story will have less of an effect on him. Before we move on from discussing the tried and true writing advice, it's worth mentioning also how these peaks relate to the central narrative question. Each peak contributes to the story's effect. Each peak contributes to how the story will be remembered, and what part of the reader's mind and heart the story will tug on. Accordingly, the desire that defines each peak should be rooted in the narrative question and should develop that question further. To pick an example, let's say our story is about defying gender roles. In this case, each major conflict should stem from some aspect of that theme. What is the cost of conforming to my gender? What are the consequences of rebelling? If I choose to rebel, how will friends and enemies change their understanding of who I am? So each peak can explore the same central narrative question, but not necessarily in the same way. The teaching analogy shows why this is effective. A good teacher does not simply repeat herself until the student claims to understand her lesson. Instead, to teach something once, she explains it in 3 different ways. 3 different analogies, 3 different starting points from what is already understood. By varying her approach, she increases the number of paths her students can take to incorporate the new knowledge into their existing understanding of things. To put all this together, an effective story will usually have a small number of high, distinct peaks in the tension wave, each rising higher than the one before. Each peak, and the rising action leading up to it, will concern itself with a different aspect of the dramatic question. By the end, the writer should answer this main dramatic question, and thereby expose to the reader's subconscious the shadow question that will stick with him and have its effect. What is missing is that we still haven't explained when a writer should break these rules of effective story structure. We've certainly explained the how. She can end with a whimper instead of a bang. She can dial up tension before the reader has the necessary context. She can fold her story up into a thicket of narrative peaks so numerous that her reader no longer has any idea how he feels. Many of the world's great stories were told without regard for the common sense rules. But why? To answer, let's go to the frame of storyteller as teacher. Teacher and storyteller come from a common archetype. Their roots in society's history are one and the same, in the poet. The poet was the conduit of culture from one generation to the next. She would wrap up the learning of her ancestors in songs and proverbs, encoding the gathered wisdom of generations. She would entertain, instruct, and pull the community into communion. But her role was not entirely passive. In times of great change, the poet had to adapt this cultural lifeblood so that it could continue to flow through the sharp river bends of crisis. She needed to map the old hymns and proverbs onto a new emerging reality so that they could continue to form a common reference point for the people of her community. The standard story structure is well suited to this task. It is memorable for both storyteller and listener. It provides moments to be struck by new events, by new resolutions of opposing forces, and it also provides moments of reflection. And like a teacher's curriculum, it provides a ladder to still deeper phases of learning. But stories need not always be crafted around lessons. The storyteller may act not as a cultural conduit. She may act as a conduit for something else, perhaps something uniquely from her mind. This is especially true in the modern industrialized world, where a storyteller's relationship to communities around herself is less immediate, as well as more ambiguous, fluid, and conflicted. The implicit goal of a typically structured story is to construct or maintain some kind of lesson. When a story diverges strongly from this structure, the result is something that destabilizes its subject matter. This is something perhaps more viable for the modern writer than the ancient poet, the storyteller as an agent of chaos. Think again of Kafka, especially of his novel The Trial. Kafka's stories are often slow-paced, beginning with a pang of horror that fades into tedium and exhaustion. Very often the theme is the law, a symbol of the moral judgment of society, a judgment that never quite comes into view in order to be reckoned with. The lesson in this case is deconstructive. Once we may have been told to abide by the law. Now we are shown the absurd futility of the attempt, and especially the futility of using our compliance as a measure of our worth. The key point for us is that with Kafka, we are not pointed toward anything else, not toward rebellion, not toward reconciliation, not toward transcendence. We simply share in the plight of K as he succumbs. This is intimately connected to Kafka's choice of story structure. A narrative climax would have entirely altered the effect of the trial. It would have needed to point to some final assertion about the law, some thesis embedded in the protagonist and his suffering. As another example, consider our case study from Chapter 5. Our intention with the case study story was subversive. On the surface, however, it did seem to follow a fairly traditional structure of rising, falling, climax. In this case, the subversive structure only becomes apparent with the second intended reading. In the second reading, what we want for these characters is different from what they want. We want them to gain self-awareness. From this perspective, the story ends anticlimactically, with every opportunity for the characters to reflect and learn about themselves being deferred, ignored, or rejected. Generally speaking, the purpose of subverting the seemingly natural rising-to-climax structure of stories is to uproot the unquestioned ideas that live within us, to twist, shatter, and drown out received lessons and values. Even seemingly minor subversions have some measure of this destructive effect. Depending on the storyteller's intent, she may or may not find deconstruction desirable. Whether she prefers to build or tear down, her choices regarding the two can now inform her choices of structure. I've been Matthias Martins. Thank you so much for listening to this reading from How to Do Things with Stories. Stay tuned for Chapter 7, Choosing Symbols.